Welcome to episode 2 of When Death Awaits. I'm Umar. We've got Chris over there on the podium and Uncle Rich. Uncle Rich, how you doing today?
Good. How are you guys?
We're doing well. Friday. And today we're going to be talking about a fun case that you did out in Signal Hill. And I think you see probably the worst burn victim you have seen in your long career. And we're excited to take everybody through it. But let's get started. Uncle Rich, take it away. How did this thing begin?
Well, as like any other case, I'm in the I'm on call for what we're in the ups, meaning that at any moment's time they could call us for a prospective murder case. In this case, I received a call around 5 o'clock in the morning on a warm, sunny day, and I was told to respond to Signal Hill, and it's a little town just nestled between Long Beach and LA, and it's not very popular, other than it was made popular at one point by a suicide incident that happened in the jail, or conceivably something else, but that's another story for another day. We won't go there today. So basically, I drive over there, and it's relatively warm that particular morning. And as I drive up into the alleyway, I see a number of patrol vehicles from Signal Hill that already had a what we refer to as a containment, or no one's let in, and so we could preserve the evidence, if you will, that's been that is there as a result of the investigation. And so I enter the location, and I keep in mind that anytime anyone goes into a crime scene, they have what they call a crime scene log, and that is you have to sign in. So unlike where you see on TV where the guy just goes under the rope, that doesn't happen. You can't just arbitrarily go under the yellow tape, but that's another story again. So what we have at this point is we have the yellow crime scene tape up on both sides, the north and the south side of the alleyway. It's an industrial area, so there's no residents in the area. It's a Sunday morning, so needless to say, all of these businesses are closed, so it's pretty isolated. And as I walk up, the first thing I notice is the what appears to be a body, and it's the configuration of a body. You got the legs, the arms, but it is completely black in color. And having been to a number of arson scenes, I will say this one was probably one of the worst burn victims that I had ever encountered. I mean, literally, the body itself was consumed in ash. The skin was completely burned. The face, the eyes, the mouth, you could see the teeth. And it was sitting there in the alleyway. And I have to look at this not in the context of, oh my God, but in the context of who did this? Because you don't look at these situations, at least from my perspective, from the perspective of, of what happened, but who did it? That's the approach that I look at these as, and in particular when it comes to murder investigations. Now, again, as mentioned in my previous episode, we have what they refer to as just a regular investigation where just one person, if it's a suicide or a baby death, we go in there as one person. But when we have a homicide, in this case, which basically means that this person was killed at the hands of another. And so at this point, we now officially have a homicide because we cannot based on the enormity of this person's injuries, we cannot determine that this is a suicide by no stretch of the imaginations. So at this point now, I'm trying to make a determination as to what basically happened.
Yeah, it'd be a pretty cruel way to potentially commit suicide in this manner. So one thing I do want to ask for you, obviously you've come in, you've made a determination, you did your log, you didn't go under the rope yet, and you saw the burn victim. What are some of the things you do, or some other myths you can dispel when you get to a crime scene? What are the first things you look for besides what you just laid out?
The first and primary objective when you enter a crime scene, before you even sign the log, you get a briefing from the handling patrol officer, whether it be Signal Hill or sheriff's deputy or any other police officer that's actually handling and containing the location. And you get a preliminary understanding of what it is that they have discovered. Now, there's been some cases where they've actually determined who might have done this, but in this case, they did not. So those are the kind of things that you look at. I also look at did anybody contaminate the scene? Did anybody go in there and move anything? I mean, there have been instances where people will grab something or move a car. We want to know all of those things specifically because it conceivably could come back later on. Now, one of the things that became very glaring to me was when I looked over, despite the fact that I was not in the crime scene. Of course, I saw the victim burnt to death, but was the issue of what was the accelerant? What was it that caused this particular incident? And I noticed there were a number of pellets about in this industrial area. The other issue, which is really unfortunate, was to try and see if there was any cameras. And I would ask the officers, are there any cameras, anything of that nature, so as maybe, conceivably, we could find out who captured this incident. And unfortunately, there was nothing in the alleyway that we were able to determine actually caught this incident, which would have been really helpful in terms of this investigation. And we have had a number of cases, but I will just say this along the lines of video, is that I've never really depended on video because arguably there could be issues with that video in terms of the description and so forth and so on. So that aside, once I've get a preliminary understanding of what they discovered, coupled with asking the questions, was anybody else in the crime scene that could conceivably have disrupted it, which in this case they did not, then at that point I sign the log and I go into the crime scene and start conducting my crime scene. One of the things that I did ask for was to work in tandem with our arson explosives folks who in fact determine how a person or how a victim is in fact killed by way of fire. They do a lot of burn victim investigations. And in this case, they determined that the source of the accelerant was in fact those pellets. And I think I mentioned is that one of the things, and I was working with an experienced arson investigator who had been with the department a number of years, and he said he had never seen a more accomplished burn victim. It was almost on the level of cremation. And when I see that, I see two things. This is just my particular perspective. I see someone who had a personal relationship with this person. And secondly, I see someone who is trying to destroy any evidence associated with this person's existence.
And we've got a couple photos here for those listening. You can check in on our YouTube channel. We've got some gruesome photos, so we'll put a little disclaimer out there. But these photos, looking at photos 1 and 5, they're pretty disturbing. This person really, as you said, was trying to get rid of any evidence and to really do the job. It almost looks like just a pile of ash. In some of these photos, you can make out obviously a body, but it is pretty disturbing.
Well, what is even more interesting too, Amar, is that once I get there and I see this person in this condition, my first objective and my primary objective, regardless of who actually committed this crime, is to find out who this person is. I cannot even discern whether it is a male or a female. And that is even more disturbing to me. Because if we do not get an identity, we can't then get a source and a direction. And there's been a number of cases like that where our first objective is to get the person identified. And once we do that, then we could catapult ourselves into a larger and more encompassing investigation.
That's a great segue. And the first natural question we had is, how do you even start this? It sounds like there's no video footage. There's nothing of a personal item, it sounds like, or that you're aware of that you can connect to ID who the victim might be here. What was your first step, and where did you start looking?
Well, so just to, again, dispel any rumors, having done this as long as I have, I've never, and nor would I ever, touch a decedent in these cases. There's just, that again is a Hollywood type of hype, that an effort to try and keep their audience entertained. The primary jurisdiction of our decedents are, in fact, the coroner's office. They take control of the remains of an individual, and then from there, they try and determine the identity of that individual. In many cases, burn victims, there have been situations where they will actually inject oxygen into the fingers so that they can inflate the finger, and then they could try to get fingerprints. But we were even beyond that.
Oh, wow.
So in this case, we noted there was a necklace, amazingly, that survived the burn. I'm not familiar with gold or what the science associated with gold, but the fact that this body and this heat was so intense that I suspect that necklace would, in fact, have been melted. But that aside, what we did was the coroner's office, took that necklace off, and I then learned, by way of my investigation, that there had been a missing person report written of a missing female. And so the coroner's office, I gave that information to the coroner's office, and they in turn went ahead and went to the residence of this particular missing persons, and they contacted the I believe she was 16-year-old daughter of the missing person. Again, we had not established whether that was the person or not, and then they presented her with that necklace, and at that point, the daughter had positively identified the necklace as being that of her mother's.
Yeah. So before all that happened, you mentioned the missing person report. I'm assuming you went then. Who did you go see first?
The primary, once I contacted the coroner's office, and they were able to then determine preliminarily the identification of our decedent, in this case, our burn victim. Then at that point, I went ahead and I believe I spoke with the daughter initially. I went over there and spoke with the daughter, and she, her mother was the mother of two, her and her younger brother, and at one point she even alluded to the fact that she was dating somebody, but we were going to assess that later on. And then I also learned from the daughter that the mother was what they refer to as a bee dancer, and that she worked in an establishment in Long Beach. Now, just for the reference, I'll give you what is a bee dancer. A bee dancer basically is a gal that works in a bar, where it's, I guess, borderline prostitution establishment, where they get paid to dance with these men who come in, and also they're provided with alcoholic beverages, and to dance with them they get money. That's basic in exchange for dancing with these individuals. They in fact get money. More than that is the fact that there were a number of females that knew each other, and so I then drove over to that location and spoke with one of this victim's associates, if you will, another dancer, and that's where the investigation kind of took a turn in terms of what I did next. So.
And what did that conversation reveal? What questions did you ask? What sort of came to light?
So basically, what her and her friend were at the bar, and the victim in this case receives a phone call. And that phone call basically was brief, according to her associate. And at that point, she hung up, and then she walked out of the bar. And as she walks out, she walks north, and her friend follows her, and she notes that she gets into a relatively new Chevy pickup truck. And then she looks, and she sees a customer who had frequented this particular location. And then they drove northbound from that location, and she didn't see them again.
So sounds like you got a decent lead, at least on the missing person. You haven't yet identified that the missing person is, in fact, the burn victim yet, but you've got a good lead on, hey, maybe you can at least solve that case, because clearly you found someone who's missing, and there were some conspicuous activity happening that night. You then took some steps. I believe you got a court order. Can you describe a little bit on what you got out of that court order? And I think it'd also be helpful for us to understand how the court order works as part of all this legal process.
Sure. I've written countless court orders, primarily for the purposes of obtaining phone records. And basically what happens is that a court order, first and foremost, and let me just go back for a minute. In talking with the daughter, she was able to provide me with her mother's phone number. So that kind of worked out in a positive way. And then I sort of, if I recall correctly, I got that phone number also from the victim's associate. But more than that, so once I got that phone number, then I wrote a court order. Now, court order basically is not a search warrant in the sense that I'm going to go into a location. Search warrants are a little more extensive. A court order basically is a authorization to go into people's phone records, their financial records, or any other business records, and without intruding on somebody's residence. So it's basically business records, if you will, or telephone records. And in this case, I was able to get the telephone records of this particular female who they provided me with the phone number. So once I got that, I can't remember the company, but I then forward that, because they have all of these telephone companies have legal offices. So they get so many of these court orders. Now, once I establish what company it is, I then go to a judge who then signs the order authorizing me to obtain those records. I then fax that over to the telephone company, and some of these companies are really good about returning your information expeditiously, which is kind of nice. So at that point, I was able to determine who she was in communication with. In particular, that particular phone call that she received about midnight.
The one where her coworker said she quickly hung up and went
Right.
out in that pickup truck.
Right. And more than that is interesting because it was a very brief call. Normally, when you get the telephone records, you'll get the telephone number and then you'll get the duration of the call. And in many instances, what we actually do is if we wanted to, we could actually get what they call a ping and determine where the phone was actually pinging from, because all these telephone companies have those fake palm trees. so we could actually get, I think within about 100 feet sometimes. I mean, I've seen many court orders where we were able to ping phone numbers and we were able to find people as a result of them still in possession of their phones. So in that regards, in this case, we didn't do that, but we did in fact establish a phone number. Now, once I got that phone number, then I got the phone number that she called at midnight. And again, I wrote an additional court order to obtain that information. And lo and behold, I find an individual who lives in Long Beach. And at that point, I went ahead and identified the individual who, in fact, was associated with that phone. So that's on photo 6.
And you were able? What other information were you able to get in that court order? Were you able to at least ID the pickup truck to the defendant, or was that something you discovered later?
Yeah, the discovery of the truck was not associated with that, as I recall, with that individual. So however he got that truck, I'm not sure, but he was not registered. He was not the registered owner.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so after you got all that info, I'm assuming your next step was to go and pay him a visit.
Yes. And again, it was pure just investigative elimination, if you will, in terms of now we know that she talked to somebody, but we didn't necessarily believe that he could be the person. That's, we're just using means of deduction, if you will. And I don't want to get all Sherlock Holmes on you here because I wish there was a level of that kind of experience, but there's not. What basically happens is that we then find the address and we knock on the door of this particular residence in Long Beach, which was not very far, ironically, from where the incident happened, probably not more than maybe 5 minutes away. Knock on the door. I did not have a search warrant for that location, so I just want to make that abundantly clear. I'm not going to go into a home unless I have a search warrant. And so I knocked on the door, and this young lady, Hispanic, spoke Spanish, didn't speak any English. She had 2 kids, probably, both of them probably less than 3 years old. And young gal, and I go, we're looking for her husband. And at that point, she explains to us that, and she was very cooperative, and she basically told us that that he worked at this particular location. And
your Spanish is pretty good.
I'm afraid it's not. Being 7 generations from Mexico, needless to say, it starts to diminish. However, having grown up in East LA, having gone to Roosevelt High School, and then having received classes in both in Spanish in high school and in college, which became pivotal, and we'll touch on that after you want. But let's go back to my encounter with the wife. She tells me, and I'm thinking to myself, and I didn't tell her anything. I said, "You're kidding me." I'm thinking to myself, that's where the incident happened. She's telling us that he works where the incident happened. So we drive over there, and as we get there, it's a plumbing shop. And I talked to the person at the desk, and I told him who we were looking for. And at that point, they directed me to this individual who was doing stocking of various items, and I told him that we were investigating an incident that happened behind his job.
And what does he look like?
He was a Hispanic male, about 5'2", weighed about 125 pounds, probably no more than maybe 25 years old, young guy. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is the guy conceivably who could have done this? But I wasn't going to draw any conclusion at this point. I don't like doing that, because when you do that, you're now putting yourself in a position where you're eliminating any other potential prospects, if there's other suspects that could conceivably be looked at.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that. I feel like if I'm there, I'm like, hey, I'm putting the puzzle together. I got all the pieces here, but I could see what you're saying. You got to take a step back and be objective.
Absolutely, 100% objective. And you want this. I mean, I don't necessarily say I want this guy to be the guy, but it would simplify things. And again, I go back to the issue of when you are in fact putting things together and how you have to draw those types of conclusions just based on building up evidence to get to where you're going to find the person responsible for this. Again, as I mentioned before, my objective is not to prosecute. I do not prosecute. I merely gather all the evidence and then provide that to the district attorney's office. That aside, what happened was, so now we're in front of this guy, and I told him in Spanish, and I said, hey, would you come to the station so we could talk? And he voluntarily came to the station. Now, keep in mind that when situation like this, even though he's voluntarily coming, and by the way, we put him in the backseat of our police car, our detective unit, and we drove him not more than maybe 5 minutes. Signal Hill is not a very big town. So it's like, drove him 5 minutes to the station, and we sat him down. And I thought to myself, okay, we're in a custodial setting. Despite the fact that he voluntarily came in, I better err on the side of caution, and I better advise him of his constitutional rights, which is his Miranda admonishment or Miranda warning, however you want it to characterize it. One of the things that I mentioned is that, I think we talked about this, and that is, regardless of what language they speak, if I have to get an interpreter for Armenian, I'm going to bring in an Armenian, whether it's Mandarin, Cantonese, Arabic, whatever the case is. If they do not understand, they're all entitled to their constitutional rights, regardless of their status here in this country. So in this case, fortunately, we had an admonishment that contained a Spanish interpretation. And fortunately for me, I was able to read that verbatim off the card. Now, that's a requirement when you, in fact, are interviewing somebody, that you have to read it specifically from the card. Because the courts do not want you to waver from the actual constitutionality that is associated with your Fifth and Sixth Amendments, and which, of course, Fifth being your, the not providing self-incriminating statements without having an attorney present. And I'm trying to simplify this. But the bottom line is that Fifth Amendment issues are big, and that's the constitutional advisement, that being the Miranda warning, clears you of any potential issues. Because, again, I don't want to go into it, but I will. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be to represent you free of charge. Right. And then at the end of that, you just say, do you understand these rights? Now, I talked about this, and I'll talk about it again, because unlike many other cases that we have, that I'm watching on these podcasts, and if I may be so critical as to say, I'm looking at these, and I'm listening to these podcasts, and I'm thinking to myself, basically, they're just reciting information from a story that they read. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, not very impressed. But when I see it from my lens, in terms of looking at somebody that conceivably could have committed such a heinous crime, I have to look at it in terms of him wanting to take control of this person. And instead of going over there and punching him in the head, I take a more civil, polite approach and let him take control of the interview. Because if you could be in control of an incident like this, you're basically, your whole entire philosophy on life is, I'm going to be in control of everything that I do. So in this case, and in many other cases, I always take the approach, hey, listen, I'm going to ask you questions, but before I do, I want to let you know you could ask me any questions you want.
So you're telling me you didn't go in there, slam his face on the table like we see in the movies?
Well, first, that would be in violation of his constitutional rights.
I've seen your home gym, Uncle Rich.
Secondly, I would just say that in the context of an interview, and of course, if we develop additional stories, which I have a multitude of stories, I want you to understand that I never invoke religion, and I never threatened, nor do I in any way, shape, or form make any promises. Those are the three precepts to an interview. And of course, the last one, and the more important one, is what you just touched on, which is you don't start to use violence in an effort to try and get somebody to say something. Knowing fully that those are the potential pitfalls, because once this gets into court, you always have to be, when you're doing these investigations, you got to look at them 5 steps forward, because what's going to be asked by a defense attorney. And trust me, having been on the stand countless times, being challenged as to what I did and why I did it, you become that's why experience and exposure to the investigative world is so important for having a positive outcome on a case. And the positive outcome is hoping that you find the person responsible and that ultimately they are in fact prosecuted and the full justice of the law comes down on them. That aside, here again with that aside stuff.
Yeah, so tell us what happened.
So I end up talking to this guy, and it's interesting. The conversation went on for 2 hours. And it was like a get-to-know-you conversation. And he was, in fact, basically denying any involvement. And at one point, I told him, I said, we have phone records. And let me just say this, just for the purposes of legalities, that as an investigator, you could actually lie to a suspect. You can actually lie to them as long as the lie is limited to the investigation. So if I told them, hey, listen, we have your DNA, people don't know this. I mean, DNA sometimes takes up to 6 months to get from the crime lab. But that aside, again, I got to stop using that word.
It's only episode 2.
Is that, but I did in this case. I didn't do that because I was just basically trying to get or solicit some information from him. And then at one point he tells me, he says, hey, listen, I was with my wife and my kids at midnight on that particular evening. And I said, well, guess what? I said, we have your phone records. And he goes, well, my wife's going to testify. Mind you, this is all in Spanish. She goes, my wife's going to testify that I was, in fact, with her. I said, that's fine. And I appreciate that. But the issue is, do you want her to perjure herself and that the courts determine that she is, in fact, committing perjury and could conceivably be prosecuted for lying in court? Now, since this is a podcast, I would just say this much. having done as many investigations as I have, I don't know how many times people have got on the stand and just lied through their teeth, and there's been absolutely no consequences to their actions.
Hey, that's not to encourage any of the listeners to lie on the stand.
Is there going to be like a red light? Blink?
Oh, we got red lights all over here.
Absolutely not. Because there's always the prospect that you could be prosecuted if you lie. I'm just saying that many instances there are, in fact, that situation. But in this case, this gentleman is not aware of that. And so, as such, I told him that his wife and children could potentially be jeopardized by her coming to court and lying, because we have evidence reflecting that you were in communication with her. And that broke it down. The guy apparently had a conscience, and he decides to tell us what happened. And basically, he says, is that he called her up, and he had apparently been in this particular establishment before. Calls her outside, and she gets in his truck, and then they drive to this particular location. And as they get to the location, they begin to have an argument, which, to me, it's interesting because when he gets into this argument with her, pushes her, is how he basically relates to us what he did, and that it rendered her unconscious. Now, I've been around enough people that when you fall back, you hit your head, conceivably you're going to go unconscious. You're not going to die. But she was unconscious. He then gets these pallets, and he puts her body on the pallets. Now, the biggest question I have as we go through this interview is why?
Yeah, this was his first reaction?
Yeah. I asked him why. Why did he put her on the pallets and burn her to death? And he didn't want to answer that question.
Ugh.
He did not want to answer that question. So now you have to draw your own conclusions. Now, we could go into the autopsy part of this whole thing, which I will, because I attend all these autopsies. As the investigator, you're technically required to attend the autopsies. And in LA County Coroner's Office, it's not fun, because you literally come out smelling the way those rooms smell. But that's another story. Oh. My thought process was just maybe she was pregnant, and he brought that to her, or she brought that to his attention. I'm like, wow. First and foremost, am I going off on a tangent anymore?
No, okay. That was my question.
So let me go back to the interview real quick. So here I am, I'm trying to keep this, like you mentioned. We're going to try and keep it sequential. So we talked to him, and then at that point, we ended up arresting him for the murder. And it's interesting because it's Signal Hill, so there's not too many murders, in particular something as heinous as this. It's a small I don't know what the population of.
According to Wikipedia, in 2010, the population of Signal Hill was 11,000.
Wow, and primarily because it's industrial, and so that said, so basically what happens is that we arrested him for, and as we're both coming out of the interview and we put him into the jail, I remember seeing the chief of Signal Hill. And we joked, we said, hey, by the way, he confessed. And I said, but you're going to have somebody wipe off all the blood off the walls. So we were kidding around, right?
Yeah. Cop humor.
So we arrested him, and then we ultimately left, and of course we attended the autopsy. And as again, I asked the coroners, which, by the way, if ever you attend an autopsy, I've been to thousands of autopsies. I don't enjoy going to that. And I don't mind the blood and the guts. I just do not enjoy the smell. The smell is the worst. And you actually put on a bunch of garb, mask, head thing, the whole 9 yards. You put on a complete regalia of PPE. And so we walked in there, and I asked the pathologist as they were doing the autopsy, I said, can you determine if she's pregnant? So they actually went into her ovaries, and they couldn't find that out. But more importantly on this thing is that they couldn't determine, based on the extent of her being incinerated, they couldn't determine whether she had lungs, heart, liver, all of that had been incinerated. And as a result, we could not determine if she was alive at the time that she was incinerated, because that could have conceivably changed the entire complexion of this particular case.
And why is that? How do the charges change if the person had been dead before or during it?
Well, if they had found soot in the throat and in the lungs, that would have basically said that she was breathing at the time when she went up in flames. But because the incineration was so extensive and the charred remains were so acute that it was to the point where they couldn't determine if she was alive at the time of her demise.
And for the legal junkies out there, if she had been alive while she was burned, that's a torture charge add on top of the murder, right?
That's correct. And so in that regards, it elevates the crime to a life without the possibility of parole. In terms of that, and it even could go so far as to even be potentially exposed to a death penalty case. So that's another story in terms of what the state of California is doing right now. But the point is that ultimately the interview was done in Spanish, so I want to talk about that in terms of the subsequent court proceedings. But before we do, I just want to touch on a couple of other things. Again, going back to contacting the wife of our suspect, I had to make sure that no rights were violated, regardless. This is a big emphasis. Regardless of where somebody's from, legal status or otherwise, the fact is everybody is entitled to the constitutional protections of this country, and I will not make it a practice to do that. And so that being said, I just want to bring that to your attention. There is one photo on photo number, I believe it's number 2, where it just clearly reflects that I'm standing there next to the victim in terms of what I'm watching.
A young, sprightly homicide detective. This is in 2011?
Yes.
Oh, you've aged pretty well.
Thank you, Omar.
Yeah, we'll have to throw that up on the socials. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about or if you can hit it quickly, the trial. This in fact did go to trial, and the defense attorney. I'm imagining, as you said, DNA takes a long while. The autopsy reports were, somewhat inconclusive on some of the extra charges. A lot of this was obviously based off of the defendant's own admission. What were the arguments made by the defense, and how did the court react?
One thing that you bring up is the confession, and that was the basis for this case. If they don't have a confession, we don't have a prosecution. Regardless of everything else that I have made, this was not a DNA case. The DNA, if there was any DNA from the defendant, now, because we transitioned from suspect to now defendant in a court of law. So now the defendant is in fact in a situation where he's being represented by an attorney. And by the way, these attorneys, whether they be public defenders or private attorneys, they have to give a vigorous defense, regardless of the extent to which this person might be guilty. And in this case, we have a confession. So what is his position? I am going to try and suppress the confession that my client did not understand the Spanish that I was speaking. And if by doing so, if the judge ruled in the defendant's and ruled on the defendant in favor of the defendant, then what we would have is virtually nothing, because we had no video. We had a witness who saw them get in the truck, but that's all circumstantial. We needed something more definitive, something more substantive, and certainly something more of an evidentiary value. And that, of course, would be the confession. So the whole basis of this particular trial was the confession. That said, the district attorney knew this, and they brought in a Cal State Fullerton Spanish speaker, instructor, professor. And she read over my transcripts, and she said, well, these transcripts, his Spanish was sufficient by way of him learning Spanish in high school and college, that it in fact elevated itself to being understood by the defendant. Secondly, the defense brought in their own Spanish expert who completely convoluted the conversation. It was like reading two entirely different Spanish interpretations of what was being said, up to and including the admonishment, which I read verbatim from a card. It was amazing.
You talk about a vigorous defense.
Right. And I was like, wow, but, you need to, use any means possible by which to, get your client to conceivably being found not guilty. And I'm not saying he's not going to be found, that he's not guilty. They're just not, they're going to find him not guilty, meaning that...
in the court of law.
Correct. So, the courts never say innocent or guilty. They say guilty or not guilty. Did the people of the state of California meet the standards of of not having a reasonable doubt? Again, I know that's technical, but we'll just go with that for right now. So, the professor testified, and now, because it was a 402 motion, which basically means a motion to suppress, the judge ruled in favor of the people by saying that that although his Spanish was subject to question, the language is that he spoke was not a science; it was an art. That's what how the judge ruled. And by the way, this judge was a no-nonsense judge who would have ruled in the defense's favor had he had enough evidence to do so. He was not going to be He did not favor either side, and so at that point, they ruled in our favor. We proceeded with the trial, and then ultimately, this individual was convicted and received 25 years to life, or 25 years to life in prison for this thing. Again, I don't know what happened to his wife and kids, but in fact, that's what happened to him. And he had a good life. You know, he had a nice apartment, he had a nice job. What would prompted him to do this to the woman, which again, why he never told us, which is disheartening, because now we have to draw our own conclusions. But I'll just say this much on a more lighter level. This guy was an amazing person to start a fire. I mean, think about in the context of putting somebody, I mean, he had to have learned this somewhere. Conceivably, he may have done this in the country that he's from. Who knows? We don't know. All we know is we prevented him from doing it again. Again, I didn't have to follow up on this case. As a homicide investigator, I could have let it go. I could have just said, okay, well, you got a victim here. She's obviously putting herself in harm's way. I'm not going to spin this and saying that she was a major contributor to our society, because those are the cases that get the most profile in our media today. But no, and in many instances, you go to court, there's nobody in the audience. Nobody representing the family. There may be somebody representing the defendant's family, but generally speaking, they're not even anybody from the victim's family. But it's the fact that we prevented him from doing this again to somebody else. And that's what ultimately, it was my objective. And I continue to do that. And if I could have somebody learn from this experience in terms of investigations, or for that matter, in terms of getting into a truck with somebody that you may not necessarily know, you know, that's another objective of mine as well.
Thank you, Uncle Rich. A lot of lessons here, learned a lot, and looking forward to more of your stories.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to telling them.